The fan hummed softly above them, cutting through the thick silence of the living room. Its rhythm had become part of the house, constant, unnoticed, almost comforting. Outside, traffic passed in distant waves, tires brushing against asphalt, lives moving forward without pausing for what was happening inside this small apartment. A wall clock ticked steadily, each second sounding louder than the last, as if it were counting something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Ion sat on the edge of the couch, scrolling aimlessly on his phone without reading a single word. The screen glowed against his face, but his mind was elsewhere. Across from him, Sarah sat with her legs tucked beneath her body angled slightly away from him. She stared at the blank television screen, its dark reflection catching her face, eyes unfocused, jaw tight, fingers twisting the fabric of her sleeve again and again. They had perfected this routine over the years. Dinner eaten quietly, dishes washed without conversation, evenings spent side by side but never together. It wasn't anger that lived between them. It was something far quieter, something more dangerous. Ion told himself this was normal. This was what marriage looked like after time had passed. Love didn't always announce itself with laughter or long conversations. Sometimes it existed in shared spaces, in familiar silences, in knowing someone would be there tomorrow morning. Stability, he believed, was its own kind of affection. Yet tonight, that belief felt thin. He glanced at Sarah, searching for something, anything that would reassure him. She smiled when she noticed him looking, but it arrived a second too late. Like an actor remembering her line after the scene had already moved on. The smile didn't reach her eyes. It never had. Not for a while. "You tired?" he asked, his voice casual, almost careless. She blinked, as if pulled back from somewhere far away. "No, just thinking about work," he offered. She nodded quickly. Too quickly, yeah. Work. Ion nodded in return, accepting the answer because it was easier than questioning it. He had learned that some conversations ended better if they never really began. He leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly, pretending to focus on the phone again, but his chest felt tight. For weeks, maybe months, he had felt this quiet shift. Conversations that used to stretch late into the night now died after a few sentences. Laughter had been replaced by polite acknowledgement. Touch had become accidental instead of intentional. He told himself it was stress, responsibilities, life doing what life always did, wearing people down. Still, there were moments he couldn't ignore. Sarah checking her phone and turning the screen away, her laughter sounding lighter when it wasn't meant for him, the way she seemed present everywhere, except here. He hated that his mind went there. He hated even more that it didn't feel like paranoia. Sarah stood up abruptly and walked toward the kitchen, then stopped halfway, as if she'd forgotten why she got up in the first place. She rested her hand against the counter, shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath. Ion watched her back, noticing how tense she looked, how small she suddenly seemed in the yellow glow of the overhead light. "Everything okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. The clock ticked, the fan hummed. A car horn blared somewhere outside and faded. "Yeah," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. She turned to face him, leaning against the counter, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes flickered toward him, then away again. It's been a long day," he nodded. Again, always nodding, always understanding. That was who he had become, steady, predictable, safe. The kind of man who didn't demand explanations or emotional labor. The kind of man who believed love meant not pushing too hard. But as he sat there, watching his wife struggle to meet his gaze, he felt a strange unease crawl up his spine. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. The sense that something had already shifted, that the ground beneath them was no longer solid, even if it hadn't cracked yet. Sarah walked back toward the couch, stopping just short of sitting down. She stood there for a moment, hands clenched at her sides, breathing shallowly. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "Ion," she said, barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" He looked up at her, really looked at her this time. The nervous eyes, the rigid posture, the distance that suddenly felt irreversible. In that instant, before another word was spoken, Ion understood something he hadn't wanted to admit all evening. Whatever she was about to say, life would not return to the way it was before. Sarah didn't sit down. She remained standing near the couch, fingers interlocked so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Her eyes moved everywhere except toward him, toward the wall, the floor, the dark window that reflected the room back at them like a silent witness. The air felt heavier now, as if the fan above them had slowed, thickening each breath. Ion set his phone aside and straightened slightly. He didn't rush her. He had learned long ago that forcing words out of someone only made them retreat further. Still, something inside him braced itself, like a muscle tightening before impact. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice uneven. She swallowed hard. "I've been trying to find the right moment, but there's never a right moment for something like this." His heart started to pound, not loudly, just fast, insistent, as if it knew what was coming before his mind allowed it. "You can say it," he replied quietly. She finally looked at him then, and for a second he saw fear there. Not anger, not defiance. Fear. Her gaze dropped almost immediately, as if it burned to hold it. "I need you to listen," she said. "Please, don't interrupt." He nodded once. "There's someone," she continued, then stopped. Her breath caught. She pressed her lips together, gathering courage that seemed to keep slipping through her fingers. I haven't done anything. I swear it's not. It's not physical. The words landed softly, but their weight cracked something open inside him. There's someone, she repeated, slower this time, as if saying it again might make it less real. And I've developed feelings. Ion felt a sharp rush of heat surge through his chest, followed by an almost icy calm. His ears rang faintly. For a moment, the sounds in the room, the clock, the traffic, the fan blurred together into a dull hum. He didn't speak. Sarah mistook his silence for permission to continue. I didn't plan it, she said quickly. It just happened. We talk, he listens, he notices things. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was looking forward to those conversations more than I should. She took a step closer, then stopped herself, as if unsure whether she was allowed to cross that invisible distance anymore. I haven't touched him, she added, almost desperately. I haven't crossed that line. But I won't lie to you either. The feelings are there. Ion nodded again, though it felt like his body was moving on instinct alone. His chest felt tight, like something was pressing inward from all sides. His mind raced through memories, shared meals, quiet nights, small sacrifices, searching for the exact moment things had slipped without him noticing. Why, he asked? The word came out steady, controlled. He barely recognized his own voice. Sarah exhaled shakily, relief flickering across her face that he hadn't raised his voice, that he hadn't exploded the way she might have expected. I've been feeling invisible, she said, like I'm just part of the routine. We wake up, we work, we eat, we sleep, and somewhere in all of that, I stopped feeling seen. Ion listened. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He let her speak, even though each sentence felt like it was being carved into him slowly. You're a good husband, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. You provide, you're responsible, you're always calm, but sometimes it feels like you're already gone. Even when you're right next to me. His fingers curled into his palm. Calm, always calm. He had worn that trait like armor, believing it protected them both. I don't feel alive anymore, she admitted. And when someone suddenly makes you feel hurt again, it's hard to ignore. Ion looked at her, then really looked at her. The woman he had built a life with. The woman standing in front of him now, asking for understanding while confessing something that shattered the ground beneath his feet. Inside everything was chaos. His heart raced. His thoughts collided. Questions screamed for attention. But on the surface, he remained still, composed, almost detached. So, he said after a long pause, you have feelings for someone else. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. Yes. Another silence settled between them. This one wasn't empty. It was heavy, loaded, final. Sarah wiped at her cheeks, her voice barely holding together as she asked the question that shifted everything. What do you want to do? In that moment, the balance changed. The confession was over. The truth was out. And for the first time that night, all eyes were on Ion. Ion didn't answer her right away. He couldn't, not because he lacked words, but because too many of them rushed forward at once. They collided in his mind, loud and demanding, while his body remained still. From the outside he must have looked calm, unmoved, almost indifferent. Inside, everything was unraveling. He felt the urge first. The sharp instinctive pull to speak, to say something that would change her mind, to remind her of what they had been. His thoughts drifted backward, uninvited. He saw them in that tiny rented room years ago, the one with peeling paint and unreliable electricity. Sarah sitting on the floor, laughing as they shared takeaway from the same box because they couldn't afford separate meals. He remembered how she used to look at him then, like he was enough, like he was everything. He had promised her stability, safety, a life where she would never have to worry about tomorrow. He had meant every word. He remembered working late nights, skipping dinners with friends, choosing responsibility over spontaneity. He told himself love was built through consistency, through showing up even when it wasn't exciting. He had believed sacrifice spoke louder than affection. But standing there now, listening to her confession echo in his head, he wondered when sacrifice had turned invisible. Another urge surfaced stronger this time. To argue, to list everything he had done. Every time he had chosen us over himself. To remind her of the vows, the years, the effort. To ask her how she could feel unseen when he had shaped his entire life around their marriage. The words lined up, sharp and ready, but he didn't release them, because beneath that urge was something darker. The temptation to compete, to prove he could be more exciting, more attentive, more everything than the man who existed only in her emotions. To ask questions he didn't want the answers to fight for a position that should have never been threatened. That thought made his chest tighten. He realized then how easily love could turn into desperation, how quickly dignity could dissolve if he let fear take the lead. He had seen it before in others, men who begged, who chased, who shrank themselves trying to be chosen again. He understood, with unsettling clarity, that he stood at the edge of that same cliff, and he stepped back. Love without boundaries, he realized, wasn't love at all. It was permission. Permission to take, permission to drift, permission to believe that someone would always stay, no matter how far you leaned away. He had given freely, believing that was strength. But giving without limits had taught her something dangerous, that his presence was guaranteed. The room felt smaller, or maybe he was finally aware of it. He watched her from across the silence, noticing how she waited, how her eyes searched his face for a reaction she could respond to, anger, pleading, anything familiar, anything that would let her know she still had control over the outcome. And in that moment, Ion understood something that changed the way he breathed. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was control. By saying nothing, he wasn't avoiding the truth. He was refusing to give his power away. The silence stretched longer than Sarah could bear. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes flicking toward Ion's face again and again, searching for cracks, for anger, for pain, for something she could respond to. His stillness unsettled her more than any outburst ever could. Ion, she said softly, almost cautiously. He inhaled once, deep, controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, and unfamiliar even to himself. If you feel something for someone else, he said, then I won't stand in the way of that. The words fell between them, quiet but absolute. No raised voice, no bitterness, no demand for reassurance, just truth, delivered without ornament. Sarah froze. She stared at him, as if she hadn't heard correctly, her brows knitting together in confusion. What? What do you mean? She asked. I'm not saying I want to leave. I just. He lifted his hand slightly, not to silence her, but to pause the spiral before it began. I heard you, he said, and I respect honesty. But I won't compete for a place that should already be mine. Something shifted in her expression. The confidence she had carried into the confession, fragile as it was, flickered and dimmed. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He wasn't supposed to make it easy. He wasn't supposed to step back. You're not even angry, she asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. I am, he replied calmly. I'm just not letting it decide for me. The room felt different now, lighter, somehow, yet unbearably tense. The power she had unknowingly held, the ability to provoke, to pull, to be chased, had slipped from her grasp. I thought you'd fight, she admitted quietly. I thought you'd ask me to stay, or tell me we could fix this. Ion met her gaze, his eyes clear, unclouded by panic or pleading. I won't ask someone to choose me, he said. If it isn't certain, it isn't mine. Sarah's breath caught. Fear surfaced where relief might have been. She had prepared herself for confrontation, for tears, for raised voices. She had not prepared for dignity, for boundaries, for a man who refused to beg for love. In that moment, she understood the mistake she had made. She had expected anger. She had never expected some. Ion didn't leave the apartment that night. He didn't slam doors or announce ultimatums. He simply stood up, walked past Sarah, and went into the spare room. The click of the door closing behind him was soft, almost polite, but it echoed louder than any argument could have. That was the moment she realized he meant what he said. The next morning unfolded with an unfamiliar stillness. Ion woke early, as he always did, but this time he didn't wait for her. He folded his blanket, straightened the pillow, and stepped out of the room without looking back. In the kitchen, he made his coffee quietly. No greeting, no tension, just absence. Sarah watched him from the hallway, unsure of how to approach him. The man who used to fill silence with small talk now moved through the space like a guest. When she finally spoke, "Did you sleep okay?" He nodded once, thanked her, and left for work. That became the pattern. They slept in separate rooms. Conversations shrank to logistics, bills, groceries, schedules. Ion answered when spoken to, but he no longer lingered. No checking in, no reaching out. He wasn't punishing her, he was protecting himself. Sarah felt it immediately. The loss of his emotional presence unsettled her more than his anger ever could have. She tried to fill the gaps with explanations. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said one evening. I was confused. I just needed time. Ion listened, always politely, always calmly. But he didn't engage. She tried something else, nostalgia. She brought up old memories, inside jokes, moments that once belonged only to them. When that didn't work, she tried closeness. She sat beside him on the couch, letting her arm brush his. He shifted away, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to draw a line. The regret crept in slowly, not the deep aching regret of lost love, but the panic of losing certainty, of realizing that the man who had always been there no longer existed in the same way. The stability she had taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. Ion, meanwhile, felt something unexpected: clarity. The noise inside him had quieted. Without constant emotional negotiation, his thoughts became sharper. He saw the marriage as it was, not as he wished it to be. He understood now that staying silent didn't mean staying weakened, that walking away emotionally was sometimes the only way to remain whole. One night, as Sarah tried once more to talk, her voice trembling, her eyes searching for reassurance, and gently excused himself, picked up his book, and returned to the spare room. He closed the door behind him and sat in the quiet. For the first time since the confession, his heart felt steady. He had chosen peace over chaos. The change didn't happen all at once. At first, Sarah told herself this distance was temporary, that Ion was simply processing, that silence was his way of cooling down. She clung to that belief because the alternative was too unsettling to accept. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing softened. His calm didn't break, his boundaries didn't bend. That was when the reality began to settle in. The conversations she once cherished with the other man suddenly felt thin, hollow. What had seemed exciting now felt weightless, stripped of consequence. She started noticing the absence Ion had left behind, the way the apartment felt colder, the way no one asked about her day with genuine interest, the way stability had quietly vanished. Fantasy had been effortless. Real loss was not. She replayed moments in her head, wondering when she had stopped seeing what was right in front of her. She compared the imagined future she had flirted with to the very real present she was now facing, and the difference terrified her. One evening the weight became too much to carry alone. She found Ion in the living room, sitting with a book, his expression unreadable. Her voice cracked before she even finished saying his name. "I'm sorry," she said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I didn't understand what I was risking. I thought I was just being honest, not destructive. I never meant to hurt you." He closed the book slowly and looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a distance that hurt more than either. She broke down then. Tears came freely, unchecked. She spoke of confusion, of fear, of realizing too late that what she had mistaken for emptiness was actually safety. She admitted that the attention she had chased was fleeting, while what she had jeopardized was real. Ion listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort her. He didn't step closer when her shoulders shook or when her voice cracked under the weight of regret. He remained still, composed, absorbing her words without letting them move him. Because somewhere along the way, he had learned something painful but necessary. Love could not be dragged back into place once it had been displaced. It couldn't be rebuilt on apologies alone. Feelings didn't return simply because consequences had arrived. When her words finally faded into silence, Ion spoke quietly. "I believe you're sorry," he said. "But regret doesn't undo choices." The truth settled heavily between them. Sarah wiped her face, her eyes searching his for hope, for softness, for anything she could hold on to. She found none, not because he was cruel, but because he was honest. Some realizations, she understood now, arrive only after the damage is done. Time passed quietly, not in dramatic leaps, but in ordinary days that slowly stitched themselves together. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the sharp edges of pain dulled into something more manageable. Ion moved forward, not because he had all the answers, but because standing still no longer served him. The apartment no longer felt like a battleground. It became a place of transition. Conversations were brief, respectful, and eventually unnecessary. When the time came, they parted without scenes or blame. No one won. No one was destroyed. Things simply ended the way they had truly been, for a long time, quietly. Alone, Ion began rebuilding in ways he hadn't realized he needed. Mentally, he allowed himself to think without self-judgment. He stopped replaying moments, stopped questioning whether he could have been more, done more, fixed more. He understood now that not every loss was a failure. Some were corrections. Emotionally, he learned to sit with silence without fearing it. What once felt like emptiness became clarity. Without constant emotional noise, he could finally hear himself. He rediscovered calm not as avoidance, but as strength. He returned to small things. Morning walks, books left unfinished for years. Conversations with himself that didn't require approval. The absence of chaos gave him space to breathe. The lessons revealed themselves slowly, but they stayed. Emotional control, he realized, was power. Not the kind that dominated others, but the kind that protected one's inner balance. And walking away without bitterness, without cruelty, was not abandonment. It was an act of love directed inward. He didn't demonize Sarah in his thoughts. He didn't rewrite the past to make her a villain or himself a martyr. He accepted that people sometimes grow in different directions, and that love alone isn't always enough to hold two lives together. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in muted gold, Ion sat by the window, watching the city settle into night. The familiar hum of traffic returned, softer now, distant. The world kept moving, just as it always had. And for the first time in a long while, Ion felt no need to chase or anyone. He wasn't victorious. He was at peace. Ion leans back in his chair, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes distant but steady, as if he's speaking to someone across the room or perhaps directly into your mind. "Here's the truth I learned," he begins, his voice quiet but firm. "Love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's permission. Permission to take, permission to drift, permission to forget the person who gave everything quietly, without demand. I gave freely, believing that was enough. But sometimes, giving without limits teaches others that your presence is guaranteed. And that lesson can cost you more than you realize." He pauses, letting it sink in. Silence isn't weakness. Walking away isn't betrayal. Choosing dignity over chaos is not cruelty, it's self-respect. And self-respect, I've discovered, can be the most powerful form of love you can offer. To yourself, Ion's gaze sharpens, and there's a weight behind every word now. A quiet insistence that comes from lived experience. I didn't need to beg. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to fight for a place that was already mine or for someone who wasn't certain enough to stay. Sometimes, the bravest act is to step back and let life show its own consequences. It's not about winning. It's about choosing peace over pain, clarity over chaos. He leans forward slightly, eyes locking as if they could see through the screen. Have you ever stayed calm while someone expected you to break? Have you ever lost someone not because you didn't love them, but because you respected yourself? If this story felt uncomfortably real, share it, and tell me would you have reacted the same way. The words hang in the air, heavy with emotion and reflection, leaving the reader with a choice to comment, to reflect, or to see themselves in Ion's quiet strength. It's not a story of triumph over another person, it's a story of triumph over fear, over chaos, over the erosion of one's own dignity, and that Ion knows is a victory worth holding on to.